Hello, my best students, and welcome again to your channel, Native Flow. Today, we are going to travel through one of the most powerful, dramatic, and influential stories in human history, the story of France, a land of kings, revolutions, wars, art, philosophy, love, power, and transformation. But this is not just a history lesson. This is a journey through the rise and fall of empires, through moments that changed Europe forever, and through the story of ordinary people who lived through chaos, beauty, and revolution. Because when most people think about France, they imagine Paris, the Eiffel Tower, fashion, croissants, romance. But behind that beautiful image, there is a history filled with battles, ambition, suffering, genius, and rebirth. This is the country that helped shape modern democracy, the country of Napoleon, the country of the French Revolution, the country that influenced art, philosophy, science, literature, and politics across the world. And honestly, the story of France is also the story of how human civilization changed over time. In this episode, you will discover how France was born, how kings ruled with absolute power, how angry citizens destroyed a monarchy, how Napoleon rose from nothing, how wars transformed the nation, and how France became one of the most important countries in the modern world. And while you listen, you will also improve your English naturally through storytelling, historical vocabulary, listening practice, and deep comprehension. So, relax, listen carefully, and let's begin our journey through the incredible history of France. Chapter number 1. Before France existed. Long before France became the country we know today, its land was occupied by ancient tribes called the Gauls. The Gauls were Celtic people who lived across much of Western Europe thousands of years ago. They were warriors, farmers, traders, and they lived in villages surrounded by forests and rivers. At that time, there was no France, no Paris, no Eiffel Tower, no French language, only tribal lands filled with different groups fighting for survival and power. The Gauls were brave and independent people. They had their own culture, religion, and traditions. They worshipped nature, believed in powerful gods, and were guided by spiritual leaders called druids. Life was difficult in those ancient times. There were no modern cities, no electricity, no technology. People survived through farming, hunting, and warfare. And for many years, the Gauls controlled the region successfully. But then, everything changed, because one of the most powerful empires in human history began expanding toward their land, the Roman Empire, and leading the Roman army was a man whose name would become legendary forever, Julius Caesar. In 58 BC, Caesar launched a military campaign into Gaul. At first, many tribes resisted fiercely. One of the most famous leaders was Vercingetorix, a young Gallic warrior who united many tribes together against Rome. For a moment, it looked possible that the Gauls could stop the Roman invasion, but the Roman army was incredibly organized, disciplined, and powerful. After years of brutal fighting, Rome defeated the Gauls, and slowly, the land began transforming under Roman rule. Roads were built, cities expanded, trade increased, Roman culture spread everywhere. Even the language started changing. Latin became dominant, and over many centuries, that Latin would slowly evolve into the French language spoken today. This was one of the biggest turning points in French history, because France was not born in one day. It was shaped slowly through conquest, migration, language, and cultural transformation. Now, something very important happened during Roman rule. The city of Lutetia, which would later become Paris, started growing in importance. At first, it was only a small Roman settlement near the Seine River, but over time, it became richer, larger, and more influential. Nobody at that moment could imagine that this small settlement would eventually become one of the most famous cities on Earth. But history was only beginning, because after centuries of Roman control, another massive transformation arrived. The Roman Empire itself began collapsing, and when Rome weakened, Europe entered a dangerous and chaotic period. Different tribes invaded former Roman territories. Violence spread, political order disappeared, and slowly, new kingdoms started rising from the ruins of the old empire. One of those kingdoms would eventually become France. A group called the Franks became especially powerful in the region, and from the name Franks came the name France. One of the most important Frankish kings was Clovis I. In the late 5th century, Clovis united many Frankish tribes together and created the foundations of what would later become the French kingdom. This was another historic moment, because for the first time, a political identity connected to France started appearing. Clovis also made an extremely important decision. He converted to Christianity. This changed French history forever, because Christianity became deeply connected to French culture, politics, education, and monarchy for centuries afterward. Kings ruled with religious authority, churches became powerful, and religion shaped everyday life across the kingdom. Over time, France slowly became stronger. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Trade increased. Castles appeared across the countryside. Powerful nobles controlled large lands, and the foundations of medieval France began forming. But life during the Middle Ages was not easy. Most people were poor farmers. Wars were common. Diseases spread quickly. And society was divided into strict social classes. Kings and nobles lived with wealth and power, while ordinary people struggled to survive. Still, France continued growing stronger politically and culturally. And eventually, it would become one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. But before that happened, France would face invasions, internal conflicts, religious struggles, and deadly wars that nearly destroyed the nation completely. And in the next chapter, we are going to explore how medieval France became a powerful kingdom, how famous castles and knights shaped society, and how one long war against England changed French history forever. Chapter number 2. Kings, Castles, and the 100 Years' War. As the centuries passed, France slowly transformed from a fragile kingdom into one of the strongest powers in medieval Europe. Huge castles appeared across the countryside. Stone churches and cathedrals rose toward the sky. Knights became symbols of honor and warfare, and powerful kings tried to expand their control over the land. But medieval France was far from peaceful. Behind the beauty of castles and royal courts, there was constant struggle. Struggle for land, struggle for power, struggle for survival. During the Middle Ages, French society was built around a system called feudalism. This system organized society into strict social classes. At the top stood the king. Below him, powerful nobles controlled large territories. Then came knights, warriors who protected lands and fought in wars. And at the bottom were peasants and farmers who worked endlessly to survive. Most ordinary people lived extremely difficult lives. They worked long hours in fields, paid heavy taxes, and depended on local lords for protection. There was little freedom, little education, and very little chance to change social class. Still, medieval France continued growing richer and more influential. Cities expanded, markets became busier, trade routes connected different regions, and Paris slowly became one of Europe's most important cultural and intellectual centers. One major reason for this growth was religion. Christianity shaped almost every aspect of life. The Catholic Church became incredibly powerful. Massive cathedrals were built across France, including the famous Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. These buildings were not only religious centers, they were symbols of national pride, wealth, and artistic achievement. People spent decades, sometimes even centuries, building them. And honestly, when you look at these cathedrals today, it's difficult not to feel amazed by what humans were able to create without modern technology. But while France was growing stronger internally, a dangerous conflict was slowly developing with its neighbor across the English Channel, England. At that time, the relationship between England and France was extremely complicated. English kings controlled territories inside France. French kings wanted those lands back, and both sides believed they had legitimate claims to power. Eventually, This tension exploded into one of the longest and most devastating wars in European history, the Hundred Years' War. The war officially began in 1337, and despite its name, it actually lasted more than 100 years. Generation after generation grew up surrounded by violence. Entire regions were destroyed, villages burned, thousands of soldiers died, and ordinary people suffered terribly. At first, England seemed unstoppable. English armies won major victories against the French. One of the biggest reasons was the English longbow. English archers could attack from long distances with deadly accuracy. French knights, wearing heavy armor, often struggled against these attacks. One famous battle was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. The English army, led by King Henry V, defeated a much larger French force. For many people, it looked like France might completely collapse. The French monarchy became weak. The country was divided politically. Fear spread everywhere. And honestly, many people lost hope. But then, something extraordinary happened. A young girl appeared and changed French history forever. Her name was Joan of Arc. Joan was only a teenager from a small village. She was not a noble, not a trained soldier, not a political leader, but she believed she had a divine mission to save France. According to her, she heard spiritual voices telling her to support the French king and help defeat the English. At first, many people doubted her. How could a young peasant girl lead armies? How could she change the future of a kingdom? But Joan possessed something incredibly powerful: absolute belief, courage, and emotional strength. Eventually, she convinced French leaders to allow her to join the military campaign, and suddenly, everything began changing. Her presence inspired soldiers, morale increased, hope returned to the French people. One of her most important victories came during the Siege of Orléans in 1429. French forces successfully pushed back the English army. This victory became a turning point in the war. For the first time in many years, France believed it could survive. Joan of Arc quickly became a national symbol, not only of military resistance, but of faith, courage, and identity. However, her story would also become tragic. In 1430, Joan was captured by enemies allied with the English. She was put on trial for her beliefs and actions. Eventually, she was sentenced to death. In 1431, Joan of Arc was burned alive at only 19 years old. Her death shocked France deeply. But instead of destroying hope, it strengthened French determination even more. Over time, French forces slowly regained territory. The English position weakened. And finally, in 1453, the Hundred Years' War ended. France survived. England lost most of its territories in France, and something important changed forever inside the French people. A stronger national identity was born. Before the war, many people identified more with local regions or feudal lords. But after generations of fighting, people increasingly saw themselves as part of one kingdom, one France. This was incredibly important historically, because wars often shape national identity, and the Hundred Years' War helped transform France into a more unified political and cultural power. After the war ended, French kings slowly became stronger. The monarchy expanded its authority, trade recovered, cities grew again, art and education flourished, and France entered a new period of transformation that would eventually lead to one of the most powerful royal systems in Europe. But while kings became richer and more powerful, another dangerous problem was slowly growing beneath the surface. The gap between rich and poor became enormous. Ordinary people suffered under heavy taxes. Nobles lived with luxury. And the monarchy began accumulating unbelievable wealth and power. For a while, the system appeared stable, but deep underneath, anger was building quietly. And one day, that anger would explode into one of the most famous revolutions in human history, the French Revolution. And in the next chapter, we are going to explore how France's kings reached incredible heights of power, how Versailles became the symbol of royal luxury, and how ordinary citizens eventually rose up against the monarchy itself. Chapter number 3, The Rise of Absolute Kings and the French Revolution. After the 100 Years' War ended, France slowly became stronger, richer, and more centralized. French kings wanted more control, more authority, more power over nobles and society, and over time, the monarchy transformed into something enormous. Absolute monarchy. This meant the king held almost unlimited power. He controlled laws, taxes, armies, politics, and in many ways, even religion. The most famous symbol of this royal power was King Louis XIV, often called the Sun King. Louis XIV ruled France for more than 70 years. And honestly, his reign completely transformed the image of the French monarchy. He believed the king represented the center of the nation. Just as planets revolve around the sun, France revolved around him. One of his most famous statements was, "I am the state." Whether he truly said those exact words or not, the message perfectly represented his style of rule. Powerful, absolute, dominant. Louis XIV wanted France to become the greatest kingdom in Europe, and in many ways, he succeeded. France became culturally influential across the continent. French fashion became admired. French language spread among European elites. French art, architecture, and literature flourished. Paris became one of Europe's most important cities. But the greatest symbol of royal luxury was something extraordinary: the Palace of Versailles, located outside Paris. Versailles was not simply a palace, it was a statement of power, a gigantic masterpiece filled with gold, mirrors, gardens, fountains, paintings, and endless luxury. The palace was designed to impress everyone who entered. Kings, nobles, foreign visitors, all were meant to feel the overwhelming greatness of the French monarchy. And honestly, even today, Versailles still feels almost unreal. But while nobles lived surrounded by luxury, ordinary people struggled heavily. And this was the dangerous contradiction growing inside France. The rich became richer, the poor became poorer, taxes increased, food shortages became common, and ordinary citizens carried most of the financial burden of the kingdom. Meanwhile, the monarchy spent enormous amounts of money on wars, luxury, and royal life. France also helped support the American Revolution against Britain, which cost huge amounts of money. Slowly, the country entered financial crisis, and as conditions worsened, anger spread across society. Now something very important was happening intellectually too. A movement called the Enlightenment began influencing Europe. Philosophers and writers started questioning old systems of power. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu promoted ideas about freedom, human rights, equality, democracy. People started asking dangerous questions. Why should kings have absolute power? Why were nobles privileged while ordinary people suffered? Why did the poor pay most taxes? Why did common citizens have so little political voice? These ideas spread rapidly, and eventually, they collided with economic crisis, hunger, and social inequality. The result would shake the world forever. The French Revolution. In 1789, France reached a breaking point. Food prices exploded, many people struggled to survive, and public anger became impossible to control. The monarchy called a political assembly called the Estates General to discuss the crisis. But instead of solving problems, it revealed how unfair French society had become. The system was divided into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, religious leaders. The second estate, the nobility. The third estate, everyone else. And the third estate represented the vast majority of the population: farmers, workers, merchants, ordinary citizens. Yet despite their huge numbers, they had very limited power. Eventually, members of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly. This was revolutionary. They claimed political authority belonged to the people, not only the king. Tension exploded across France, and then came one of the most famous moments in world history: the storming of the Bastille. On July 14, 1789, angry crowds attacked a prison in Paris called the Bastille. The prison itself was not extremely important militarily, but symbolically, it represented royal oppression. When the Bastille fell, it became a symbol of revolution, a symbol that ordinary people could challenge royal power. Today, July 14th remains France's national holiday, because that moment changed the country forever. At first, many revolutionaries wanted reform, a constitutional monarchy, more equality, more rights. But events quickly became more radical. The monarchy weakened, political divisions intensified, violence spread, fear grew everywhere. Eventually, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were arrested, and in 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. Soon after, Marie Antoinette was executed as well. For centuries, French kings ruled with enormous power. Now, the monarchy itself had fallen publicly before the people. Europe watched in shock. Many kings across Europe feared revolution could spread to their own countries. Meanwhile, inside France, the revolution entered an even darker phase, the Reign of Terror. Led by radical revolutionaries like Maximilien Robespierre, the government began executing suspected enemies of the revolution. Thousands of people died by guillotine. Nobles, political opponents, even ordinary citizens accused of disloyalty. Fear controlled daily life. People never knew who might be arrested next. The revolution that began with dreams of liberty and equality became increasingly violent and unstable. And honestly, this period showed something important about human history. Sometimes revolutions born from hope can become consumed by fear and extremism. Eventually, Robespierre himself was arrested and executed. The terror ended, but France remained politically unstable. Governments changed repeatedly. Chaos continued, and many people desperately wanted order and stability again. That is exactly when a young military leader began attracting national attention, a man who would become one of the most famous figures in world history, Napoleon Bonaparte. And in the next chapter, we are going to explore how Napoleon rose from near obscurity to dominate Europe, how his ambition transformed France forever, and how his empire eventually collapsed dramatically before the eyes of the world. Chapter number 4, Napoleon Bonaparte and the Dream of Empire. After years of revolution, violence, political chaos, and fear, France was exhausted. People no longer wanted endless instability. They wanted order, strength, security, and at exactly that moment, a young military officer began rising rapidly through the ranks of the French army. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and honestly, few people in history changed Europe as dramatically as he did. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, shortly after France took control of it. He came from a modest family, not from the highest nobility, but from a young age, he showed extraordinary intelligence and ambition. He studied military strategy obsessively, he read constantly, and he developed a powerful belief in his own destiny. During the French Revolution, many experienced officers disappeared from the army because of political turmoil. This created opportunities for talented young commanders. Napoleon took advantage of that moment perfectly. His military victories quickly made him famous across France. People admired his confidence, his discipline, his strategic genius, and most importantly, his ability to bring victory during uncertain times. At a time when France desperately wanted stability, Napoleon looked like a savior. In 1799, he seized political power through a coup. Soon afterward, he became the leader of France. And although the revolution had destroyed absolute monarchy, Napoleon slowly began building something surprisingly similar, centralized personal power. But unlike the old kings, Napoleon presented himself as a man of merit and achievement. He claimed success should depend on talent, not birth. And honestly, this idea inspired many people. Under Napoleon, France underwent major reforms. Education systems improved. Government administration became more organized. Laws were standardized through something called the Napoleonic Code. This legal system influenced countries around the world and still affects modern law today. Napoleon also modernized infrastructure, banking, and state institutions. So while many people remember him mainly as a conqueror, he was also a major reformer. But Napoleon's ambition did not stop with France. He wanted to dominate Europe itself. And for a while, it looked like nothing could stop him. French armies marched across the continent. Victory after victory followed. Austria defeated. Prussia defeated. Large parts of Europe came under French influence or direct control. At the height of his power, Napoleon controlled or influenced enormous parts of Europe. And honestly, many people feared him almost like a force of nature. His military speed and strategic brilliance shocked opponents repeatedly. One famous battle was the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. Often considered one of the greatest military victories in history, Napoleon defeated larger enemy forces through brilliant tactics. After victories like this, his legend only grew stronger. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. This moment shocked many people. The revolution had fought against monarchy and absolute rulers, yet now France once again had an emperor. But Napoleon believed he was building a new kind of empire based on merit, nationalism, and modern administration. For many French citizens, he represented national pride and strength. And honestly, his rise showed how quickly societies can move from revolution to authoritarian leadership when people become desperate for stability. Now here's something important. As Napoleon expanded his empire, he also spread revolutionary ideas across Europe. Ideas about equality before the law, modern government, national identity, even countries fighting against him were influenced by these changes. So, in many ways, Napoleon transformed Europe politically and socially, not only militarily, but eventually, his ambition became too large, and that became his greatest weakness. One of his biggest mistakes was invading Russia in 1812. At first, Napoleon marched into Russia with a massive army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But the Russian strategy was devastating. Instead of fighting directly, Russian forces retreated deeper into the country while destroying food supplies and resources behind them. Then came the brutal Russian winter. Cold, starvation, disease, exhaustion. The French army collapsed under impossible conditions. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers died during the retreat. The invasion became a catastrophe. And after this disaster, Napoleon's enemies across Europe united against him. Slowly, his empire began falling apart. In 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. For many people, his story seemed finished. But Napoleon was not ready to disappear. In one of the most dramatic moments in history, he escaped exile and returned to France. And incredibly, many soldiers immediately joined him again. This period became known as the 100 Days. Europe panicked, armies mobilized again, and finally, in 1815, Napoleon faced his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. The battle ended his rule forever. After Waterloo, he was exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, far away from Europe, far away from power. There, he spent the final years of his life before dying in 1821. But even after his defeat, Napoleon's impact never disappeared. He transformed warfare, government systems, national identity, law, education, politics across Europe. And honestly, people still debate him today. Was he a hero, a dictator, a genius, a conqueror? Perhaps he was all of them at the same time. That complexity is exactly why Napoleon remains one of history's most fascinating figures. Meanwhile, France itself entered another period of uncertainty after his fall. Monarchies returned, political tensions continued, revolutions would rise again, and throughout the 19th century, France kept struggling between monarchy, democracy, empire, and republic. But the country was also changing rapidly through industrialization, science, art, and modern ideas. And in the next chapter, we are going to explore how modern France emerged through revolution, industry, world wars, resistance, and reconstruction. and how the nation eventually became the France we recognize today. Chapter number 5: Modern France, World Wars, and the France we know. Today, after Napoleon's fall, France entered one of the most complicated periods in its history. Governments changed constantly, kings returned, revolutions exploded again, empires rose and collapsed, and throughout the 19th century, France kept searching for political stability. At times, the country was ruled by monarchs, then republics, then emperors again. It was a century filled with uncertainty and transformation. But while politics remained unstable, French society itself was changing rapidly. Factories appeared across cities, railways connected regions, industry expanded, technology advanced, and millions of people slowly moved from rural villages into urban areas. Paris especially transformed dramatically during this period. Wide boulevards replaced crowded medieval streets. Modern buildings appeared, cafes, theaters, museums, and cultural institutions flourished. And honestly, Paris became one of the cultural capitals of the world. Artists, writers, philosophers, scientists, all helped shape modern French identity. France became famous for literature, painting, cinema, fashion, architecture, and intellectual thought. Names like Victor Hugo, Claude Monet, Gustave Eiffel, and Louis Pasteur became internationally respected. The Eiffel Tower itself was built in 1889 for the World's Fair in Paris. At first, many people actually hated it. Some artists called it ugly and ridiculous. But over time, it became one of the most recognized symbols on Earth, and eventually, the symbol of France itself. But while French culture flourished, Europe was slowly moving toward catastrophe. National rivalries increased, military tensions rose, empires competed aggressively for power. And in 1914, the world entered one of the deadliest conflicts in human history: World War I. France became one of the main battlefields of the war. Huge sections of northern France were destroyed. Millions of soldiers fought in brutal trench warfare. Conditions were horrifying: mud, cold, explosions, disease, constant fear. Entire generations were traumatized. One of the most famous battles was the Battle of Verdun, a battle so devastating that hundreds of thousands died during months of fighting. For France, World War I left deep emotional scars. Although the country survived and emerged on the winning side, the human cost was enormous. Families lost fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Entire towns mourned together. And honestly, many people hoped humanity would never experience such destruction again. But sadly, another even more devastating war would arrive only 2 decades later: World War II. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded France with incredible speed. French defenses collapsed quickly. Paris was occupied, and France faced national humiliation and fear. Part of the country came under direct German occupation. Another part was controlled by the Vichy government, which cooperated with Nazi Germany. Life during occupation was extremely difficult. Fear spread everywhere. Food shortages increased, freedom disappeared, Jewish citizens faced persecution and deportation, and many ordinary people lived under constant anxiety. But not everyone accepted occupation silently. A resistance movement slowly formed inside France. Men and women secretly fought against Nazi control through sabotage, intelligence gathering, underground newspapers, and support for Allied forces. These people became known as the French Resistance. Their courage became one of the most important symbols of French national pride during the war. Meanwhile, a French military leader named Charles de Gaulle refused to accept defeat. From abroad, he encouraged resistance and promised that France would eventually be liberated. And finally, in 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy during the famous D-Day invasion. This operation became one of the largest military operations in history. Slowly, France was liberated from Nazi occupation. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Paris was freed, and World War II eventually ended in 1945. But once again, France emerged from war emotionally exhausted and physically damaged. Still, the country began rebuilding rapidly. New industries developed, infrastructure improved, education expanded, modern democracy stabilized, and over time, France became one of the leading nations of post-war Europe. France also played a major role in creating what would later become the European Union. After centuries of devastating wars between European countries, many leaders wanted stronger cooperation to prevent future conflict. France became one of the central forces behind European integration. Meanwhile, French society itself continued evolving. Immigration increased. Cities became more diverse. Technology transformed daily life, and modern France emerged as a complex, multicultural nation balancing tradition and modernity. Today, France remains one of the most influential countries in the world, known for art, fashion, food, philosophy, cinema, science, politics, tourism, and culture. Millions of tourists visit France every year. People dream of seeing Paris, walking near the Seine River, visiting the Louvre Museum, exploring old villages, or standing beneath the Eiffel Tower at night. But behind that beauty stands thousands of years of history. History shaped by wars, revolutions, ambition, creativity, suffering, and resilience. And honestly, that is what makes the history of France so fascinating, because France was never only one thing. It was royal and revolutionary, elegant and violent, traditional and innovative, broken and reborn many times. Its story reflects both the greatness and complexity of human civilization itself. Now, before we finish this journey, I want you to think about something important. History is not only about kings, wars, and dates. History is about people. Ordinary people trying to survive difficult times, dreaming about better futures, fighting for freedom, creating art, building nations, changing society little by little. And when we study history, we understand humanity more deeply. We understand how the modern world was built, and perhaps we also understand ourselves better. So today, you did not only improve your English listening skills, you traveled through thousands of years of human history, from ancient Gaul to Roman conquest, to medieval castles, to revolution, to Napoleon, to world wars, and finally, to modern France. And honestly, that journey itself shows how powerful human civilization can become through struggle, adaptation, and transformation. Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this historical English podcast, subscribe to Native Flow for more deep English learning journeys through history, culture, psychology, and powerful world stories. Keep listening, keep learning, keep growing, and I will see you in the next episode.